Good afternoon and welcome to this EHS Today webinar, 2023 Midseason Hurricane Report, Key Findings and Future Projections, sponsored by AlertMedia. And now I would like to introduce your other moderator for today's event, Katie Goen, Director of Content and Communications at AlertMedia. Welcome, Katie, and without further ado, the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Hi, everyone. I am so thrilled to be your moderator today. I cannot believe we are already nearly halfway through this hurricane season, but I'm certainly glad that you're here today because, spoiler alert, there is some tropical activity out in the Atlantic, and our speakers today are going to give you the rundown on all of that and much, much more. So with that, I would love to introduce you to our speakers today. First, we have Jason Moreland, who's our in-house senior meteorologist at AlertMedia. Jason graduated from the University of South Alabama with a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology. And he has a decade of professional experience in the private sector that includes international, domestic, and offshore forecasting. And throughout his career, Jason has provided critical decision-making support to a wide range of businesses, live event venues, and even sensitive utility projects ahead of impending hazardous weather. So we are certainly in good hands today. Hi, Jason. Thanks so much for being here.
Hey, thank you so much, Katie, for the intro. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, we also have Sarah Prattley with us today. She's the Senior Vice President of Global Intelligence at AlertMedia, where she leads a team of experienced analysts to monitor emerging threats and incidents around the world. And prior to AlertMedia, Sarah was the Vice President of National News for CNN's domestic news gathering unit. So she led the network's coverage of many major events, including things like the Boston Marathon bombings, Orlando Pulse nightclub shootings, several natural disasters, and many, many more. So hello, Sarah. Welcome.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks for the warm introduction. Super excited to dig in today with everyone.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both for being here. I do want to quickly just go over the agenda for the day so we all know what to expect over the next hour. First, we're going to review the 2023 hurricane forecast and talk about what you can expect for the remainder of the season. We'll talk about some potential impacts and hazards that you'll want to be aware of. We'll talk about how to prepare and protect your people and your assets. And then finally, we have some recommended resources for you to help just keep you up to date on the hurricane activity. But before we get into any of that, I would love to go ahead and launch our first poll. So you're going to see a few polls pop up today. I would love it if you guys could participate in those. It's just really a nice way to get to know where everyone is and know what you're here to learn today. So the first question we have for you is, how prepared is your organization for the remainder of hurricane season? Would you say that you're very prepared, somewhat prepared, unprepared, or maybe you're just unsure? So I'm going to go ahead and give that just a few more seconds. If you could go ahead and get your answers in now, and then let's go ahead and share those results so we can all see where everyone is. Okay, perfect. All right, so interestingly enough, all of the answers are represented here. So clearly we're kind of across the board when it comes to hurricane preparedness, but it looks like most folks chose very prepared or somewhat prepared. So let me go to you, Jason. Is that about what you were expecting to see?
Yeah, it's definitely promising given that we're almost halfway through the season. We definitely want to make sure that we're more prepared than ever as we get into late August into September. And for those that may feel like they still have some makeup room to do, I mean, you picked a good place to start today by listening in.
And what about you, Sarah? Anything to add?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say it's helpful to know that people are at least kind of prepared in some way, shape, or form, but always more that we can all be doing to kind of support our preparedness, especially as we get into hopefully the meat of the season.
Excellent. Okay, well, without further ado, I would love to go ahead and pass it over to Jason, who's going to review the forecast and just let you know kind of what we've seen so far this season. Jason, it's all yours.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So before we get into what's currently happening out there across the Atlantic, it's good to start off with some of the latest seasonal forecasts. You may have heard some of these in the news over the last couple of weeks. So it's not uncommon to hear about what hurricane season expectations are as we get into May and into the first week of June, which is the start of the Atlantic hurricane season. But as we start to get into early to mid-August, a lot of the big national seasonal forecast agencies put out updated mid-season look-aheads, because really it's these next 3 months that are going to tell the true story about what the season is going to look like once all is said and done. So with that, the first one is from Colorado State University. Researchers at CSU have been putting out seasonal forecasts for the Atlantic for decades. They were one of the first pioneers to get into seasonal hurricane forecasting. So thus, these people are highly respected when it comes to their forecast numbers. Usually, their numbers end up pretty close to reality once all is said and done. As you can see on the left-hand side, in 2022, they predicted 19 named storms, 9 of which were set to become hurricanes. And of those, 4 were expected to become major hurricanes. That was at the start of the season. That was the initial forecast. We ended up with 14, 8, and 2. So if anything, we ended up with a little less in the way of storms, but they were pretty close in terms of that total hurricane count. They projected 9. We ended up with 8. Fortunately, there were only 2 major hurricanes, but we still had some significant hurricane activity to keep track of, as we all know, especially down there in Florida toward the second half of the season. Now, looking ahead to 2023 or the rest of the season, still looking at expectations of 18 named storms, 9 hurricanes, and 4 major hurricanes. Just for a little bit of comparison, the most recent 30-year average is closer to 14, 7, and 3. So we're looking above normal across the board if this forecast were to verify. As we switch gears, this is the latest outlook from NOAA. They came out with an update just this past Thursday. So both of these forecasts are relatively new. When their initial forecast came out in May 2023, they had forecast 12 to 17 storms. That has now since recently been bumped up to 14 to 21. As you can see, their forecast is a little different. They do provide ranges, but nonetheless, the overall forecast scenario is the same, because when you look at hurricanes, they're now going with 6 to 11. So they've also increased the number of total hurricanes that are expected this year. Again, the seasonal average is closer to 7. And then of those 6 to 11 hurricanes, 2 to 5 are expected to become major. So far this year, we've only had 5 named storms and 1 hurricane. So if we get anywhere close to this, that means it's going to be a very active second half to the season. As we take a look at some of the key drivers, what are some of the main parameters that these agencies are looking at when putting together these forecasts? Because I feel like we've seen these numbers before, but we don't necessarily know about the primary drivers. Well, the first thing you need to know, the Atlantic, Gulf, and Caribbean have been within a very active phase that can often last 30 to 50 years if history tells us anything. Ever since 1995, there has been seasonal variability. Every year is a little different, of course. But when you look at the overall trend, since 95, that high activity era has been well in place. Most seasons have been above normal. And this is really because there's long-term climate patterns that favor above normal water temperatures in the Atlantic. This is in addition to some of the broader conversation about global climate change and what may be causing some of that. We know for a fact that within the Atlantic basin exclusively, there has been long-term drivers supporting more enhanced activity since at least the mid-90s. To take that a step further, if we just look at the last 2 to 3 months, at least out of all the satellite era years dating back to the 1960s, the Gulf, the Caribbean, and Atlantic on average so far are some of the warmest they've ever been on modern record. And of course, one of the very bare bone basics about Atlantic hurricane activity and hurricane forecasting in general is the warmer the water, the more fuel these storms have to really get going. So it is certainly a concerning development to see near record, or even in some places, record-shattering water temperatures. I know there's even been some stories within the last few weeks where some of the Florida Keys water temperatures are approaching 100 degrees, and we're having some issues with coral reef bleaching because of the record warm water. So this is certainly a concerning thing going into the peak of the Atlantic hurricane season. Now, what this also does is it usually results in an atmospheric response where there's less in the way of vertical wind shear, there's less in the way of African dust coming off the African continent. So overall, this is just a favorable pattern getting going across the Gulf, Caribbean, and Atlantic. We also have a more enhanced monsoon coming off the coast of Africa. This is important to take note of because this is the main source region for a lot of tropical disturbances that usually stem from that area and then go on to develop as they move across the Atlantic and Caribbean later on. So all of these favorable factors so far are offsetting what is now expected to be a pretty strong El Nino in the Pacific during the second half of the year. And usually what El Nino tends to do is it enhances hurricane activity on the Pacific side, but downwind of that, there's usually more suppressing dry air, wind shear, and negating impacts for Atlantic hurricanes. But given the record warm water across the Atlantic, we're not really seeing that wind shear come to fruition just yet. And so that's why both NOAA and CSU are still hammering home the anticipation of a very active second half of the year. So just to kind of also sum up where we've come so far in the last, roughly 2.5 months or the first half of the season, it's been pretty lackluster, at least if you're a general audience member along the U.S. There's really been next to nothing eventful. There's been a total of 5 named storms, one of which became a hurricane. But as you see on this graphic, that was Hurricane Don, which just performed a loop out in the middle of nowhere in the Northeast Atlantic. But really, aside from that, there was one tropical storm that struck some of the islands in the Eastern Caribbean that did produce some flooding and destruction of homes, but been pretty quiet across the Gulf, the West Atlantic. There was an early season tropical storm in the Eastern Gulf, but it really dissipated before it made its way on into Florida or Cuba. So far, so good, right? So that's kind of what things have looked like, at least through the first couple of months. But in terms of notable milestones, we did have some unique things that have already happened this year. One of those far North Atlantic storms had actually developed in January. At the time, the National Hurricane Center was not issuing advisories on this because they didn't want to confuse the public. There was a nor'easter happening within the mid-Atlantic and Northeast U.S. at the time. So the last thing that we wanted to do from a communication standpoint was start talking about some sort of slow-moving offshore low-pressure system that acquired some subtropical characteristics, didn't really impact any land masses. And then we did get off to a pretty active start in June. There were 2 simultaneous named storms in the Atlantic for the first time during that time of the year since 1968. And a lot of this development was happening well out into the central and eastern Atlantic, east of the Caribbean Sea. And usually we don't see that area get going until more so late August and September when the Cape Verde hurricane season really ramps up. So there were already some initial indications that there were some unique things happening this year, despite this influence of El Nino. And for the last several weeks, we've been a bit quieter, but that doesn't necessarily say what could be coming down the pipeline in the weeks and months ahead. So with that, this is the latest current outlook. You can see that it is starting to look a lot more like hurricane season based on the latest 7-day graphical outlook from the National Hurricane Center. We have not just one, but now 3 different areas of interest. So let me go from east to west. We're beginning with the easternmost 2. We have 2 strong tropical waves off the coast of Africa. Those both have a medium chance of becoming the next named storm within roughly the next 5 to 7 days. The good news here is that aside from the Cabo Verde Islands, the initial guidance at least indicates that there will be tracks mainly toward the north away from the Caribbean Sea. And even if they did move a little bit farther west than forecast, we're talking a good week from now. So no immediate concerns from those storms out there near Africa, at least at this time. And then we also have what is now a new area highlighted this Wednesday morning across the western and central Gulf of Mexico. Anything that gets going in the Gulf this week is going to be a much more slower evolution. We're talking about Sunday through Tuesday of next week before there's any really organized broad disturbance south of Texas or Louisiana. And with that, there's also a lot of track guidance discontinuity, a lot of inconsistency there with some solutions ranging as far east as Florida, some as far as west as Texas. But ultimately right now it looks like a rainmaker for parts of the Gulf Coast into early next week. But given the record warm water temperatures, certainly something to be mindful of during the weekend into early next week. And then as we take a look at the satellite image, just to reemphasize, there's nothing necessarily in the Gulf that is overwhelmingly ominous right now. If anything, those 2 systems well off on the right edge of the screen near Africa, those are the more impressive systems. But again, those are pretty far out at sea. One other thing I'll say really quickly, on the far left-hand side, this new tropical storm by the name of Hillary was not included by the Atlantic Hurricane Center graphic. This is more on the Pacific side of Mexico. And I know that we mainly have interest that may be tuning in from the Southeast U.S. or the East Coast. But for anyone in far Southern California or Western Arizona, I'm talking about this weekend into early next week. We're looking at the remnants of what's going to be Hurricane Hillary making their way across the Baja Peninsula into the Southwest U.S. early next week. This is going to start to get some more media attention. We're not talking about a bona fide identified hurricane making its way all the way into California, nothing like that. But there will be a lot of heavy rainfall, and there could be flood watches issued, especially along and east of the mountains to the east of San Diego. So just a quick heads up for anyone that could be tuning in from the Southwest U.S. But again, no major immediate concerns in the Atlantic, but definitely signs that things are starting to pick up out there. So as we switch gears a little bit, I wanted to talk a little bit more about climatology, or what we can expect based on historical averages. And it may seem unusual for me to say this late into August. We're now talking about August 16th. But based on this date, there's still about 87% of total Atlantic hurricane season activity ahead of us. So if you look at this primary chart on the right-hand side, we're about to go up this very large mountain of activity as we head into the final part of August, and then through September, and then even into the first 2 to 3 weeks of October can remain very active out there, especially across the Gulf, Western Caribbean, Southwestern Atlantic, Bahamas area. So even though the calendar might say something, historically, the real meat of the season is over the next 6 to 8 weeks. I've also included some additional dates about the first average date of the named storm, but just for some additional perspective, the first named storm of the season usually forms by August 22nd. I should say the fifth named storm of the season. And then the first hurricane usually forms on August 11th. We've already had both the fifth named storm and the first hurricane already. So even though it feels like it's been a little slow, from a numbers perspective, we're actually slightly ahead of that. And again, all the indications are that we're going to continue to trend above normal for at least the next 2 months. Now, this is one question that I get quite often is, what are the long-term trends? Are we really seeing major changes based on all this climate change talk that we're hearing about? So let me try to break things down as best as I can really quick. So on the right-hand side, we have this graphic. This is illustrated more so of global hurricane activity. So we're counting all the tropical cyclones, typhoons, hurricanes. They're all different names, but they fall under the same umbrella. When it comes to hurricanes and major hurricanes, there really hasn't been that much of an upward definitive trend. We have seen slight increases, especially in the Atlantic, in terms of named storms. And some of this is partly because the Hurricane Center has gotten so much better at detecting minimal storms with advances in satellite technology, Hurricane Hunter, reconnaissance data, things of that nature. So the signal in terms of whether or not climate change is modifying the numbers globally, that remains to be seen. But certainly the Atlantic has been very active over the past 30 years, in fact, dating back to mid-1995, like we were just discussing. And when it comes to climate change elements, and what is that doing to the overall threat posed by hurricanes? Well, we are often seeing slower moving storms, especially as they move inland. We're seeing more extreme inland rainfall events. And so it's going to be these long-lasting impacts that can occur well after landfall that will keep us on our toes more so than maybe we've seen a little bit in the past. And there also has been a recent trend towards more rapidly intensifying storms near the shoreline. We were just talking about record warm temperatures in the Gulf of Mexico. If trends like that continue, then that doesn't bode well for more rapidly intensifying storms near places like Texas, Louisiana, Florida, the list goes on. So what may seem like a minimal disturbance, well, things can change really fast in the tropics. So always keep it tuned, especially this time of the year, to the National Hurricane Center. So that's a little bit about the long-term trends. Now let's talk about some of these potential hazards that we should be thinking about when making those hurricane preparedness kits and so on. So I just talked a little bit about this, but this is a graphic that shows some of the historical extreme rainfall amounts that we've seen with all prior landfalling storms across the U.S. I've already touched on, it was kind of odd to start this conversation today with talks about Arizona and California, but we have seen extreme rainfall events of hurricanes make it in that far. And then we've, of course, seen the likes of Hurricane Harvey across Texas in recent years. We're talking 50, 60 inches of rain in some of these events over, just the last 5 to 6 years. Hurricane Florence in the Carolinas, we're talking about devastating impacts well away from the shoreline. And then there were two more recent cases. So in 2021, we had Hurricane Ida, which made landfall as an upper category 4 across Louisiana. You would think that that's where some of the worst impacts were, and rightfully so. But look at the Northeast United States in the bottom right-hand corner. There was a secondary rainfall maximum associated with the remnants of Ida as it made its way across Southeast Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York City. That event prompted a flash flood emergency in New York City. It was the first one in the city's history. There were nearly 10 inches of rain within a very short period, And the flooding event from that storm killed 55 people in the Northeast alone. Nearly 6 times more people were killed by flooding in the Northeast than from directly along the Gulf Coast from the hurricane itself. Then if we fast forward to last year, Hurricane Ian makes landfall across Southwest Florida. We all know about the storm surge near Fort Myers, but what you might be forgetting is that nearly a dozen people died from inland freshwater rainfall flooding across central and northeast Florida. We're talking places from Orlando northeastward almost to Jacksonville, Florida. So do not hesitate to think about the impacts of being in a low-lying area that is susceptible to river flooding and flash flooding. Certainly something that we don't want to dismiss here. In terms of other inland impacts, we've also seen the risk of tornadoes. This is one of the lesser common things, but there can be tornado outbreaks with landfalling hurricanes if all the atmospheric conditions come together just right. This is another example of impacts extending well away from the landfall center. In the case of Hurricane Ida, we saw several quite notable tornadoes out across the mid-Atlantic and northeast U.S. And then when it comes to power outages, maybe not so much of a surprise that over 1 million people were left without power along the central Gulf Coast after a major hurricane. But look at Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. We're still looking at over 100,000 people that lost power due to severe thunderstorms. Part of that is related to the tornadoes that we just talked about, but oftentimes the remnants of these hurricanes will get caught up with mid-latitude storm systems associated with the jet stream. You get increased wind shear, so you get more damaging wind gusts, and again, those isolated tornado events. And then also when it comes to breaking down some of the statistics behind direct fatalities when it comes to hurricanes, we often think of hurricanes as being these wind-driven monsters, right? We see all the really amazing videos of the Category 4, Category 5 winds. We're talking gusts over 150, 160 miles per hour. So we think of hurricanes as being these wind machines, and they definitely are. But when it comes to the deaths being confirmed in the U.S., it's really the water that's still killing the vast majority of people. You can make a case that when you add up storm surge, freshwater, rainfall, flooding, and some of the surf along the coastline, nearly 90% of all hurricane-related deaths, at least direct fatalities, have some sort of water component associated with it. So the general rule is to hide from the wind and run from the water. If you're in a storm surge prone location and a storm surge washer warning is issued for that area, then the best advice would be to certainly evacuate. And even if you move into a more inland area, are you close to an estuary or a river or a stream that's prone to flooding? Because if so, it could be the most, impressive structure and you're completely safe from wind-related impacts. But if you have to be rescued by boat later on, it may not do you much good. So just something to consider when it comes to those direct impacts. And then something that's overlooked even more so are going to be indirect fatalities caused by these landfalling events. This is a much lesser known fact, but there have been recent studies that showed over the past 12 years, even excluding Hurricane Ian last year, more people have been indirectly killed by these storms than winds, storm surge, and flooding on their own. And a lot of times these indirect fatalities are coming after the storm makes landfall. So think about during the cleanup process. You have people getting up on top roofs for the first time in years. They're operating hazardous equipment that they might not be used to operating on a daily basis. You're getting injuries out in the field. There's no electricity. There's a lack of medical service, or it's seriously degraded compared to normal. You have an increase in carbon monoxide incidents because you have people running generators for the first time, perhaps ever, or maybe for the first time in years. They're too close to the home. You're getting toxic fumes being injected into people's rooms. And every single year, without fail, there's at least a handful of carbon monoxide related poisonings and fatalities. So certainly still something that we're trying to eliminate. And then even when it comes to evacuations, these are very stressful events. You can have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people all clogging the roads at once. You see an increase in vehicular incidents. So the list really goes on here. And so you have to think about vulnerable members of the population, especially the elderly, going through situations like this. So that's why it's best to get ahead of the curve as much as possible and to really set your hurricane plan in motion before things really become chaotic. And this could help really trend these numbers lower as we see these storms make landfall. So that's a little bit on my end. And Sarah, I'm sure that you have a lot more to talk about when it comes to hurricane preparedness from a business standpoint.
Awesome. Yeah. Thanks, Jason. So much great information on the forecast and just kind of the science behind it and so many good takeaways. I'll go ahead and really transition towards some of those business impacts. And unfortunately, as we all know, there are numerous potential impacts in any hurricane season. One that we've paid much more attention to in recent years is the impact to the remote workforce, right? This is the current reality that we all live in. Earlier this year, we actually did a study of more than 2,000 U.S. workers to really understand their perceptions of safety in the workplace. And I wanted to highlight a relevant stat from that. Our research showed that 82% of employees feel that their employer has a responsibility to keep remote workers safe. So a really big number there, obviously really prevalent, again, with the way that the workforce has changed in this day and age. Many businesses do have employees working remote situations. And as we all know, this presents safety challenges, particularly during seasons like this, the hurricane season in particular. Jason mentioned several things earlier when it comes to how hurricanes can impact the entire country, no matter whether they're near the coast or inland. So we'll go ahead and keep pushing forward. There are several other factors we always want to hit on as well. And a number of them here. There's always a number of other ones as well, but fuel shortages is definitely a big one. Sometimes really due to the impact in the Gulf on oil rigs, right? Lots of business out there, but also other occasions due to infrastructure impacts in areas that are actually hit by storms. Sometimes actually, depending on the storm, both of those things can come into play. So definitely something bearing keeping an eye on. We also see, as we look around the globe in particular, that there is a continued struggle when we think about supply chain issues, really reinforced by kind of what we're seeing overseas. Businesses and employees really need to be prepared both at office locations and at home when we think about those supply chain kind of pressures and disruptions. So definitely something else to kind of take into consideration and to take note of as we're, mid-season right now and should really be knee-deep in preparing, but a good time to kind of reconvene over those things. We've also continued to see strains on power grids. During natural disasters in particular, we're obviously seeing a lot of heat in the United States in particular right now. So lots of impacts there. As with all things, this of course can impact physical office locations as well as folks who are working remote. Also, obviously their ability to stay online. And then businesses in areas hit will also of course experience downtime, really resulting in loss of revenue and productivity. But also a good point out there just to kind of remember again, storm-prone areas and the domino effect that this can have, whether it's affecting a site or where you have remote workers. And then lastly, once disaster strikes, immediate help and funding is always a concern. I'm sure many of you have been watching what's been happening in Maui. It's not necessarily direct hurricane, but indirect hurricane. Of course, we're keeping an eye on the wildfires. There's been a lot of stress on the community there and a lot of note taken to how long it's taking for resources, right? Funding and resources, whether they're localized or from the national level, can generally take days to reach a community. So really important as you're preparing as a business to make sure that you are prepared to help not only your business and your facilities, but also remote workers in locations, because it can take days and definitely something we're taking note of right now. Before we move on, I also want to give a quick summary of some of the most important points that we've covered so far. So Katie, if you take us to the next slide, we've obviously shared a lot, in the short time that I've been speaking, but also with Jason. So just some key takeaways to really keep in mind. An average to below average hurricane season can still deliver devastating impacts. I know we've mentioned this a few times. We mentioned this in a lot of the conversations that we have, but it only takes one storm to really kick up the impacts. We're certainly also seeing more extreme rainfall that can extend well inland. Jason had that great graphic up earlier, really noting that it's not just coastlines that see impacts. It really is trending further inland facilities, but with where your workers are. Prepare and protect your remote employees, right? That's what I was just getting at. Whether they're on-site or remote workers, it's just as important to make sure you take into consideration where your workforce is and how they could be impacted by a lot of these different things as it relates to hurricanes or otherwise. The aftermath of a hurricane often causes more deaths and injuries than the storm itself. A good reminder of what Jason was talking about earlier. He said, hide from the wind, run from the water. Of course, after all of those things take place and run through, there are a lot of other impacts that we see that can cause deaths. And then the arrival of help, again, can take days. So just really important to make sure that you and your teams are prepared and that you're preparing all of your employees as much as you can. All right. I will go ahead and take a breather for just a second because I think Katie has another poll question. So I'll pause.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a good time for the next poll. So let's go ahead and launch that. This time we'd like to know, which business impacts are you most concerned about experiencing at your organization? Is it maybe those fuel shortages and supply chain disruptions Sarah mentioned, power outages with those grid concerns, loss of revenue and productivity from downtime? Maybe it's the funding and the resource concerns, or of course, the protecting remote workers. So I'm going to give you guys just another couple seconds there. If you could go ahead and get your answers in, and we will send results. Okay. It looks like power outages are the biggest concern, but again, everything is represented here. So obviously we're on the right track with the certain hazards and potential impacts that these things can have. But let me ask you, Jason, is that surprising to you? Is that what you thought?
Not terribly surprising. Obviously, these are multifaceted threats that we have to deal with when it comes to hurricanes. And when it comes to power outages, these can be events that cause power loss for weeks, if not months in extreme cases, which can certainly mean a lot of havoc for a business.
Sarah, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just agree with Jason. Obviously, power outages they can be really impactful, not only to kind of current business sites, but as we see remote workers popping up, it's definitely a concern there. So a lot of these probably tethered together in folks' minds as well.
Absolutely. Okay, well, thanks for participating in that poll, everybody. Now we're going to move on to some best practices to help you prepare and protect your people and your property. So Sarah, do you want to go ahead and walk us through that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Katie. As Katie just mentioned, and really the reason that we're all here is because now is the perfect time to really be preparing and reviewing folks' hurricane preparedness plans, not after there was already a storm, of course. And I know we're mid-season, but again, this is a really great time to kind of be brushing up and having these conversations with your team. So with that, make sure that you are involving your people in the process. They will obviously be able to help you understand and also help you partner throughout your safety and preparedness. So make sure you're communicating these things across, kind of the multitude of teams that you're working with, so that they can be prepared and they can, again, help you to understand what is going to, potentially cause additional impacts when a hurricane strikes. Also provide them with resources, right? They need to be able to monitor forecasts, whether you're helping them with that or giving them the resources to do that. So it's really great to help them get in front of impending storms. Some of the things that Jason has shared earlier about current forecasting, really great things to continue to share with your teams. Now is also a good time to conduct those very important tabletop exercises, really walking through things, creating that muscle memory, right? The more that we talk about these things, the more we review plans, the more we and our teams are really kind of getting into that second nature when something does strike. And then finally, really encouraging employees to devise their own at-home preparedness plans. We mentioned remote workers. We've got folks in hybrid situations. It's really important that as a company, as organizations, we're thinking not only about our facilities, but really encouraging our employees to take ownership of what may happen at their own sites and kind of taking preparations with their own physical home, maybe with their children, elderly, even their pets in these circumstances and times. Thinking about and focusing on your physical property, super important too. A few tips here really to kind of think around as we're, again, mid-season and looking for a lot of activity in the coming weeks. Of course, making sure you're reviewing any necessary county mitigation plans for any unique potential threats that might impact your area. Counties are generally really good about outlining those and really great resources. Inspect roofs, gutters, all kinds of things like that where you can get clogged debris or maybe just things that aren't necessarily secure. They can be shored up really quickly ahead of time. Now's the time to do that, of course. You can hire a licensed professional, right, a contractor, to really resolve any of those outstanding issues or even to help you identify those ahead of time. Under no circumstances, we've heard this before, should you tape your windows. I've heard of this happening in certain cases and scenarios. It is not safe. Really important to point out there are a lot of things that you can do. Obviously, there is impact-resistant glass, but also a lot of folks that have kind of pre-cut boards that they keep on hand. So just something to kind of keep in mind to combat some of the things that we see in these areas. And then also, obviously, making sure that you either have a generator on hand, considering backup power, and making sure that you are safe, you understand how to operate those things. things, or maybe your employees that are using these things at home understand how to operate them. As Jason mentioned earlier, deaths indirectly related to storms, we do see a lot of those related to generators. So they're really great and really important at keeping people kind of online and connected and with some power source, but really important to just keep things above board and making sure folks know how to use those. And as we all know, ensuring your physical property is at its best in advance of the hurricane season is also something to really strongly consider right now. So this includes everything from reviewing your localized plans, really doing a lot of these things is going to help you at this point. This is a really great checklist to kind of start going through, and probably things as you talk to your team that you'll continue to go through and identify for, again, workplaces as well as remote workers. All right. We all know that communication is incredibly important and critical, especially at AlertMedia. That's really kind of the core of our business, is making sure that our customers, that we're helping them to communicate. So thinking about this from that before, during, and after approach can be really incredibly helpful as we're kind of creating plans and seeing where the gaps are. So when you think about that before approach for developing storms, you can obviously proactively warn your people as soon as you see a storm approaching. It's also a great time to share those preparedness plans, any advice, any evacuation information, so details that you're seeing with all of your employees and facilities. You'll also want to make sure that you are providing a way for employees to ask questions or request help, right? Having two-way communication is great for this so that you can actually have that engaged conversation. And this is also a really good time to manage employees' expectations regarding when new information and updates are going to be shared and how from the organization. Expectation setting and transparency is a really great practice here to really set yourself and your employees up for success. When you think about kind of during or as the storm is approaching, or during those high impact times, as you get closer to the storm's progress, establishing a cadence of those updates can be really important, helping your employees to understand the progress of the storm, the current path, any potential impacts. That's just really important to stay communicating with your team. It's also a good time to check on your people with surveys, wellness checks, really understanding their safety and security, and anything that they may need as the storm clears. And then you can, of course, use those responses to divert any resources that you can, either at that point or, of course, after, when things are safe. And then that last column, that last stage in the aftermath, let your in-office employees know if your facilities and operations have been impacted, whether they've been impacted or not. Really important to keep those lines of communication open to expectations that when people can either come back to work or may need to stay away. Your employees should also have a way to let you know if they've been impacted. Again, this is a really great way to expectation set. Some people may not have electricity, may not have capabilities with Wi-Fi, may not have a way to get into the office. So a really good time to understand what impacts you are seeing, not only at your office, but maybe at employees' homes, whether they're remote or not. So communication through each phase of the storm obviously is truly essential at keeping your employees safe and connected. And that's really going to help you focus on those recovery efforts if needed. Hopefully not, but obviously we live in the realistic world. Okay, so another key way to keep your people and property and your business safe is really by proactively monitoring for and identifying storms. Jason shared a ton of great information earlier. This is really the kind of information you want to be consistently gathering and being able to share. One way to do that is investing in a threat intelligence solution like ours at AlertMedia, really to help you understand expected impacts of a storm based on geographic footprint of your organization, where your people are, where your assets are, and you can identify emergent risks faster, as well as respond real time with automated impact assessments and warnings. There's also a lot of really helpful public resources out there that we always like to point out. I know we'll have some at the end of the presentation, but things like hurricanes.gov, they are consistently updating with information. NOAA, obviously really important in those efforts. So just another great resource for folks to take into consideration. I know at this time of year, I'm on their website all the time as I talk to Jason and our team of meteorologists as well. All right. And then before we wrap things up, I know we have shared a ton of information. I know you'll remember everything, of course, but I think really there's probably 4 key takeaways as we think about everything that we've shared with y'all today. First, no matter the hurricane forecast, you can never rule out last minute and late season threats. We're mid-season now, as Jason pointed out. There's certainly a large, meaty portion of the season left to go. So definitely take that into consideration and really keep that in the forefront. It's also critical to plan and prepare, right? Your organization can plan and prepare early so that everyone is ready to respond. It's not too late, right? We're only mid-season, plenty of time left, especially right now. And then even if you don't have employees or locations in hurricane-prone areas, from a lot of those graphics and stuff that Jason showed earlier, you can still be impacted by so many of the different threats: flooding, tornadoes, power outages, and more. So really important to take into consideration not only those coastal locations. And then lastly, use the tips we've shared today to really help you stay informed about hurricanes and communicate with your employees before, during, and after, right? All three stages, no matter which stage you're in, it's really important to share that information across all communication that you can with your employees. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Katie.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I do want to do just one final poll, and this one's going to be really quick because I want to get to all of your great questions that are coming in. So just take a quick second, if you could, to let us know, would you like to learn how AlertMedia can help you better protect your people and business from a hurricane? You can say yes, and we would love to get you more information on that. You can also say no, not at this time. And of course, no hard feelings. We are here if you ever need us down the road. So let me give you just another second there. Then we can go ahead and close out this poll and get to some questions. And we have some great ones coming in. Oh, and just a reminder, guys, these don't actually have to be questions that you submit. If you have a comment or an observation or maybe a lesson learned from something you've experienced from a hurricane, let us know that too. So, Jason, no surprise here. I'm going to start with you. Someone would like to know, what's the difference between the different hurricane models? There's Canadian, European, and there's even a spaghetti model. What do you believe is the best to use, and which one do you utilize?
Yeah, so I know that the spaghetti model plots have become a favorite to show on air to convey uncertainty, but at the same time, I do have to say that a lot of the spaghetti models shown are sometimes not the best hurricane models. On average, the American GFS, the ECMWF, those are some of the global dynamical models that have a better track record. And then the Hurricane Center also has a bunch of internal models, including model guidance that takes a consensus of some of the more reliable tracks. And so those are all being formulated into the latest Hurricane Center forecast. And ultimately, it may sound cliche, but it is true that none of those models are better than the official Hurricane Center forecast. So when in doubt, pay very close attention to the cone. Just know that the cone is not going to also show exactly where the main impacts are going to be. Sometimes you can have significant impacts that extend well outside of the forecast cone as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that clarification. And then someone would like to know if you have any good resources for hurricanes in the Pacific affecting Asia. Are those the same resources, or is there something different you'd suggest there?
So if you go to hurricanes.gov, that website largely covers everything from the Atlantic westward all the way into the Central Pacific, including Hawaii. Once you get into the Western Pacific, the U.S. Joint Typhoon Warning Center is one of the better resources to get a very even, clear look at things, although technically it is the Japan Meteorological Agency that is the premier forecast agency for typhoons in that basin. So either one would usually give you the type of information that you need to know. And of course, we are tracking everything here also at AlertMedia.
Excellent. Thank you. Sarah, this one is probably best for you. Do you foresee preparedness or cleanup supplies being limited? Things like sandbags, lumber, power tools, generators, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know we've seen this in the past. We haven't recognized anything at this point, at least domestically, as far as shortages, but I think it's important to note that can change in an instant, especially if there is a storm brewing that looks like it's going to impact a certain area, right? We see this all the time, the runs on the stores. We saw toilet paper during COVID, but a lot of times the things that you mentioned, Katie, that the person asked about, lumber, sandbags, those are the things that go really quickly as soon as an area is likely to be impacted. You know, a good rule of thumb is to have some of these supplies on hand, especially if you know that your business has needed them in the past. So it definitely something that I would include in your preparedness is making sure that you do have some of these supplies on hand so that you don't have to be one of the people that's making a run on the store. Also really, important to pass that information along to some of your employees too, as they recognize things that they may need to do in their homes. Some people may want to have some of those supplies on hand as well.
That makes sense. Thank you for that. And then, Jason, how sensitive are the models to incorporate volcanic activities and fossil fuel or forest fire burnings? Is the main drivers of the sea temps and the wind direction versus atmospheric pollutants?
So thankfully, although some of those things are certainly playing a longer term role when it comes to specific forecasting for individual tropical storms and hurricanes, it is a lot of natural variability within the weather pattern and fluctuations within the jet stream that we would normally see with or without those impacts. And so those are still the main drivers of the intensity and track forecast, at least on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. So overall, those things are not considered quite as much, but long-term, for every single season, we are seeing an increase in rain events. And so these are long-term trends that we're seeing as a result of some of those climate change related patterns. But again, for specific hurricanes, individual setups, usually from a forecast approach, we're not looking so much at those different variables.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. And then I actually have a comment here that I just want to read. Thank you for sharing this scenario. I won't say your name, but you know who you are. This person says, I was living in Panama City, Florida on October 8th, 2018, when Hurricane Michael wiped Panama City and Mexico Beach off the map. My family evacuated to Birmingham, and when we returned, we heard nothing but horror stories from those who stayed. So my advice is evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. Can't say that loudly enough. You try to be prepared, but you just don't know what it's like until you've lived through it. So I think that is an excellent cautionary tale. So thank you for sharing that. Jason, I'm going to go back to you here for a second. Has there been talk about moving hurricane season prior to June and after November?
Yeah, there have been some conversations about bumping up the official date to coincide with some early season activity that we've seen. Maybe not so much this year, but especially the last 6 or 7 seasons prior to that. There were consecutive years in which there was either a late April or May tropical storm. So far, the decision has been made to keep the official start date for June 1, at least on the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Gulf side, because most of the real hurricane activity, not just the weak tropical storms, are still heavily centered into that late August, September, October timeframe. But with some of these more recent early season storms, the Hurricane Center has sped up the first issuance of daily tropical weather outlooks. Those are now issued beginning May 15th every year.
Okay, gotcha. Sarah, this one's probably best for you. You talked about communication quite a bit. When do you think is the best time to start communicating with employees about hurricane preparedness and impending storms?
Okay, absolutely. I mean, as soon as possible. I think when you think about it from a preparedness standpoint, it's kind of a year-round endeavor, right? I think at the early end of the season, that's an important time to remind people about preparedness plans and really getting people kind of thinking around it. As far as for specific storms or activity, I think as soon as your company is monitoring something that they recognize or that you recognize could have some sort of impacts, it's important to just flag it to your employee population. I think the sooner that you can get things in front of your employee population and maybe executive stakeholders, other people within kind of parts of business continuity or plans that you have that will need to be enacted, the sooner that you can get people across these things, the better. I think worst case scenario, you flag something that doesn't end up being anything, but as long as you've been transparent, hey, there's something brewing out here, we're keeping an eye on this, we'll keep you posted. I think it just gets people into the right mindset.
That's a great answer. And that actually segues into a great segue into our next question. One of our attendees today is from Hawaii. Bless you and your family. Hope everything is going okay for you. But they had a hurricane pass south of the islands, and the National Weather Service said that they were going to experience strong winds and rain, but none of this happened. What within their forecast model is not reliable, or why did this not come to fruition? Thoughts, Jason?
So I would be a little curious as to which specific storm that they're referring to, because it has been quite active in Hawaii this season already. So Just for a little bit perspective, last week when we had the damaging wildfire situation, there was a significant hurricane by the name of Dora that passed to the south of Hawaii. Now, it did pass far enough away to where there were no real impacts in terms of widespread shower activity or squalls, but it did indirectly enhance the northeast trade winds over the island. So with dry vegetation, because they are still experiencing drought, along with the uptick in those trade winds, again, a bit of a slight indirect influence from the hurricane passing to the south, we saw the devastating effect of the Maui wildfires. Also, just looking ahead, there are additional storms moving towards Hawaii from the east. We have now Tropical Storm Fernanda. The good news about Fernanda is that it is expected to fall apart before it gets to Hawaii. It is going to be below tropical storm status, but in a few days, more so into early next week, let's call it, there could be some remnant elevated wind speeds along with what could be some beneficial shower activity. So the immediate concern would be maybe the winds cause another uptick in fire weather conditions. But this time around, we do think with the closer in track that the showers could help to offset that risk a little bit this time around. So far, though, luckily, no major hurricane impacts are expected anytime soon for Hawaii.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for that clarification. We have a great tip that came in, so I'm going to go ahead and read that off to everybody. This is in regard to notifying your employees about what's going on in your communication strategy. And it says, a tip to get more employees to sign up for alerts and add their personal cell phone numbers into the mass notification tool is sending the alerts right before the storm hits. That provides information or asking folks if they've evacuated. Then other employees will realize that they did not receive the alert and will then update their profiles to get them in the future. So I think that's an excellent tip. Thank you for that. And then let's see, Jason, what are your thoughts on the intensity measurement of a storm versus using only the wind-based measurement for reporting?
Yeah, this is becoming an increasingly bigger debate because winds are only part of the story, right? The other difficult thing to grapple with, though, is that the same storm, if you move the landfall location from one state to another, that could also impact the overall types of conditions. So, for example, the southeast coast of Florida, at least certain parts, certain counties have a far lesser storm surge risk because of the way the continental shelf is shaped, whereas along the central Gulf Coast, it's pretty shallow in terms of that continental shelf. You can kind of walk well out from the beach into the waters without it really passing above your head too much. And so that very shallow slope allows for a greater storm surge to build up over time due to the increasing winds ahead of the storm center. So places like Louisiana, Mississippi, they're incredibly vulnerable to storm surge. So the same storm with the same size and the same wind speeds can produce far greater impacts in one spot versus another. So in terms of coming up with the perfect scale, it's really hard to do so because there is no perfect one size fits all. Every single storm situation is a little bit different, but you're completely correct in saying that the category based solely on wind speeds does not tell the entire picture. And so when it comes to preparation and monitoring storms, you need to be looking at not just the forecast cone, the forecast track, but also the latest flood watches and the various other weather alerts being issued by the National Weather Service that can also extend well inland beyond that center track line.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's another comment that I think is really interesting, so I'll read this. One of the most dangerous conditions with the aftermath of a hurricane are the people that are desperate and will do whatever they need to do to survive. Fort Myers has been called the Wild West with all the crime happening in that area post-storm. I think that is something to really consider, right? Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that? I know I'm kind of putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, I think that some people will definitely stay behind. I think somebody mentioned this earlier with Hurricane Michael. I definitely think we see some of the wild, wild west aspect. I know that we're seeing some reports. I mean, going back to Hawaii of looting, it does happen. It's pretty typical when we think about kind of the aftermath of a storm. When you think about just that wild, wild west comment too, it is very chaotic, especially when strong storms go through an area. There's a lot of devastation. I think it can bring out sometimes the best in people and maybe the worst in people as well. But I think it is something that's interesting to consider and kind of think around. Those are just kind of my initial thoughts, but I think it's definitely something to have conversations about. I think most times people have the best of intentions, though.
Absolutely. All right, we have time for one more question. So Jason, I'm going to direct this one to you. Do you recommend that employees in hurricane-prone areas have a go bag ready?
100%, especially this time of the year. I may have said this a little bit in the past about when it comes to big hurricanes, you can oftentimes see these 3, 5, sometimes even 7 days in advance. But there has also been this trend where in recent years, you can have a tropical storm that will rapidly intensify from, again, just a minimal tropical storm to a major hurricane within no more than 24 to 48 hours. So even if the forecast is calling for something like that, a lot of times the public perception begins to change once the storm has already begun to undergo that rapid intensification phase. So with that, there can still be a lot of intensity uncertainty within just 1 or 2 days prior to landfall. Things can change very quickly when it comes to a forecast during especially the peak months of the year. We have record warm water temperatures in the Gulf and the Southwest Atlantic. So this is a very dynamic and volatile situation that we could wrap ourselves into. All it takes is one disturbance to move into this zone with 1 week of light wind shear for things to really start to change in a big way really fast. So I don't think it hurts at all to be as prepared as possible and be ready to be on the move, especially if you're in one of those more storm surge vulnerable areas along the coastline.
Excellent. Well, thank you guys so much for all of your fantastic questions. There were a few we didn't get to, so I apologize for that. But I will have some contact information for you guys in a couple of slides. So if you would like to continue the conversation, you may. But right now, I want to give you those additional resources we talked about earlier. So Jason and Sarah recommend that you check out these resources to stay as up to date as possible during hurricane season. Don't feel like you have to rush to jot these down right now. We will send out a recording after this, so you can make a note of these or bookmark them. But these are all great resources that could help you. And again, as promised, I wanted to offer you some contact information for Jason or Sarah. They are also both on LinkedIn. So if you do have additional questions or just want to make the connection, please don't hesitate to reach out. And with that, I just want to thank Jason and Sarah for their time today. I'll start with you, Jason. Thank you so much for your insights and expertise.
Oh, thank you so much for having me today. Thank you for everyone tuning in, and please don't hesitate to reach out if there's any questions.
Awesome. And Sarah, thank you so much for your time. It's always great to hear your insights as well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Katie. Hopefully we were able to inspire some folks to kind of reconsider some of their plans or maybe even reinforce some of the things that y'all are already doing. So stay safe.
Absolutely. Well, that does conclude our presentation for today. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate all this great audience engagement, and we hope to see you on a future Alert Media webinar. And of course, I want to thank EHS Today for their partnership and for hosting us today.